Out of every 4 men who sailed on a German U-boat, 3 are still in their boat, somewhere at the bottom of the ocean. That is a 75% death rate, the worst of any branch of the entire German military. But this is strange because the U-boats twice came close to starving Britain out of the war. So what went so wrong that the most feared thing in the Atlantic became little more than prey? It all started in World War I. Submarines, or as the Germans called them, Unterseeboot, which the Allies then renamed U-boats, weren't seen as something that could actually be used in war at the time. The first boats were small, crude, incredibly dangerous to their crews, with only one torpedo tube. But as the technology slowly advanced, this thing started to look promising for the new situation the Germans found themselves in. When the First World War broke out, Britain, as the world's major naval force, placed a blockade on Germany in the North Sea to strangle its ability to wage war. No supplies were reaching Germany through the sea, guarded by warships and riddled with underwater mines. And the Germans knew that there was no way to win an open naval battle against Britain with their much smaller navy. But as the U-boats evolved just enough to not kill their crew so often and to be able to patrol far away from their bases, the Germans got the idea to reverse the situation on the British and strangle them in return. The Germans actually went into the war with only a few submarines and well behind their enemies. Britain had the largest submarine force with some 75 boats. Even France had about 50. But the Germans were about to make the best use of them and begin the terror on Allied ships, the kind that would carry over into the next war, just on a much, much larger scale. Germany's first attempts with U-boats were bad, as the early boats were notoriously unreliable and dangerous to their crew, but they improved over time, going from kerosene to diesel engines, paired with batteries and electric motors while submerged. Then came September 5th, 1914, when the Germans opened the hunt on British ships. U-21 sank the British light cruiser HMS Pathfinder with a single torpedo. Actually, the first ship in history sunk by a self-propelled torpedo fired from a submarine. Out of about 270 men on the ship, only 18 survived. On September 22nd, U-9 sank 3 British warships in under an hour, killing about 1,500 sailors. Everything changed almost overnight. Because Britain was an island that shipped in most of its food and supplies carried by unprotected merchant ships. And that was their weak point. The Germans couldn't beat the Royal Navy on the surface, but U-boats could slip past the warships and then cut off Britain from supplies it couldn't live without. At first, U-boats followed older rules of war called prize rules. When a submarine wanted to sink a merchant ship, it would surface, stop the ship, and let the crew get off into the lifeboats before sinking it. The most successful submarine commander in all of history was a German U-boat captain, Lothar von Arnold de la Perrière, who sank 189 ships, most of them under these polite rules. However, it wasn't long before the Germans changed their mind and decided to go all in, declaring unrestricted submarine warfare. They began sinking merchant ships without warning. The British also contributed to this decision with their so-called Q-ships, armed ships disguised to look like merchants. When a U-boat came to stop one, the Q-ship would break cover and attack it. Quite a few U-boats got sunk this way, so now any ship in the seas around Britain was fair game. It pretty much spiraled out of control at the start of 1917, when Germany decided to gamble it all on submarine warfare. At the peak, about 1 in every 4 ships that set out for Britain never arrived. And for a stretch of 1917, Britain came close to being literally starved out of the war. However, this didn't mean things were going easy for the Germans, and especially not for their U-boat crews. The early U-boat actually spent most of its time on the surface, and only submerged to attack or hide. It ran on diesel engines on the surface, which also charged the batteries, and then on batteries and electric motors while underwater. They couldn't stay underwater for long, and there was no system for air purification, so it was the same as if you sat in your car and breathed that same air with 50 other sweaty men. The batteries sat under the crew compartment, and while discharging, they gave off hydrogen. If not ventilated properly, it could gather inside and explode, and if seawater reached the batteries, it created chlorine gas that could poison the crew, both of which happened to quite a few U-boats. Inside was damp and hot, which created all sorts of problems for a human body. And not to mention that there were no showers and water was only for drinking or cooking. So yeah, just imagine the smell after a several week-long patrol. They carried a small number of torpedoes, usually about 6, and typically had a deck gun to use when on the surface. And of course, the Allies weren't waiting around to devise ways to sink the U-boats. Although they didn't have anything much better than underwater mines and ramming for fighting submarines at the beginning beginning of the war, they came up with the depth charge. This was a canister of explosives set to explode at a certain depth, which would be thrown from the ship when the U-boat was under or close to it. When it exploded, the shockwave would break the hull of the U-boat. It would haunt the U-boat crews much more in the next war. Now, the first U-boat crisis ended with a change in how ships sailed. It's also said that the U-boats helped bring the United States into the war, as American citizens were dying by the hundreds on the attacked ships. The convoy system was introduced, with merchant ships grouped together and escorted by warships. Losses dropped sharply, as the U-boats were now getting hunted themselves. Out of around 360 U-boats that Germany built in the First World War, 178 were destroyed by the Allies, with about 5,000 crewmen going to the bottom with their vessels. Many U-boats simply never came back, and no one ever knew why. They could guess by their last known location, but most of the time they simply didn't return, and that was it. So the First World War ended, and the Germans were ordered to surrender all their remaining U-boats and were strictly banned from developing them again. But the Germans went on making them anyway, just underground in preparation for the new war, where the U-boats were going to reach new levels of horror, both for the Allied ships and their own crews. Because the conditions were similar to those of the last war, Admiral Dönitz argued that the same idea could work again: strangle Britain by sinking ships faster than they could be replaced. They were looking at it as a tonnage war. Tonnage here actually means how much internal cargo space the ship has, and 1 ton in this sense is about 100 cubic feet of enclosed space. So the only thing that mattered to the Germans was to sink as many ships as they could, pushing this tonnage number as high as possible. When the war began in 1939, Germany had only about 57 U-boats, 20 of which could go across the ocean. The U-boat that would do most of the fighting was the Type 7, and the Germans would make around 700 of them during the war. The design was pretty similar to the World War I U-boat, with the diesel engines and batteries. It was about 67 meters long, with a crew of around 44 men. It could carry 14 torpedoes fired from 5 tubes, along with a deck gun and anti-aircraft guns. The fall of France in June 1940 changed everything. The Germans now controlled the French Atlantic coast, and they moved their U-boat bases there. From there, they could reach the shipping lanes much faster, and from July, they began their war. They were sinking a staggering number of ships, and for very little loss. This was called the Happy Time, as in 4 months they sank 282 Allied ships. U-boats were attacking mostly from the surface at night, when they couldn't be seen, because the technology of the time could detect them only while they were submerged. However, the Happy Time suddenly ended in March 1941. The Allies were learning, and new tools were beginning to strip away the cover of darkness the U-boats used to hunt. But before we get into that, just take a look at what it was like to be on a U-boat, let alone with someone actively trying to kill you. Because it carried tons of diesel fuel and ran heavy electrical machinery, fire was competing with flooding to be the biggest danger to the crew. If a seal burst or a valve was worked in the wrong order, or even a toilet was used wrong, it could sink the submarine and kill the entire crew. You see, some U-boats had a high-pressure toilet that could be used deep underwater, but the system was so complicated that if you did something wrong, the water would come back into the boat. This is what happened to U-1206, when flooding reached the batteries and it was forced to the surface, where Allied aircraft then spotted it. As for the men inside, conditions weren't much better than on the earlier U-boats. They'd be crammed together in a steel tube for patrols lasting anywhere from 3 weeks to several months. There weren't enough bunks for everyone, so the men hot-bunked, meaning you'd be lying in a bunk still warm from the man lying before you that just got up for his watch. They were sleeping among the torpedoes and machinery, and only the captain had his private office, which wasn't much larger than a locker. There was no washing, no bathing, and no shaving for the whole patrol. Food was fresh only in the first few days, and then there were only tins. The crew could stay underwater for about 3 days at most with the early air purification systems, but they were only helping a bit, and the carbon dioxide would get to dangerous levels very quickly. The other problem that haunted German U-boat crews was their own torpedoes, because they often didn't work. The first problem was with the detonators. The main type was a magnetic pistol, which was meant to set the warhead off as the torpedo passed under a ship's keel, but most of the time it fired too early or too late or not at all. The backup was a contact pistol, which was meant to fire on a direct hit, and it often failed to do so even when the torpedo hit the ship's hull dead on. And the second problem was in depth keeping. Torpedoes tended to run 2 or 3 meters deeper than they were set to, so even if the crew did everything right, the torpedo could harmlessly go under the enemy's ship. Early in the war, this was a huge problem for the Germans, as 1 in every 4 torpedoes malfunctioned in one way or another. Just imagine you were on a patrol for 5 weeks, risking your life lining up for a textbook attack, then doing all the calculations right and launching a torpedo, revealing your position, only to watch it hit the enemy ship and turn out to be a dud. One British ship was hit by 3 torpedoes at close range, and they all failed to detonate. The Japanese, on the other hand, had the best torpedoes in the entire war. Their so-called long lance torpedo ran on pure oxygen instead of compressed air, which gave it much greater speed and almost no wake, while carrying a heavier warhead. They were quite a problem for American ships in the Pacific. However, the Japanese, despite being Germany's allies, didn't want to reveal this technology to them. Now, when a U-boat was sunk, it almost always went down with its entire crew. But there were several other horrific ways the crew inside could die. Of course, fire, flooding, and drowning were the biggest fears, but other times it could get more terrifying and longer. When a U-boat was damaged by enemy fire or a depth charge, it could lose control and go into a vertical dive. This could also happen if the U-boat spotted enemy aircraft and tried to submerge as fast as possible, then lost control on the way down. Hulls of the time could go down to about 250 meters before the risk of pressure crushing them became really high. At one point, like what happened to that little sub exploring the Titanic recently, the U-boat would implode and get crushed with everyone inside. But other times, in shallower waters, the U-boat would hit the bottom before the pressure killed the crew. Now the crew would be, say, 200 meters underwater, lying on the seabed without power and with water probably rising. They'd be there, stuck without a way out, and just waiting for hypothermia, suffocation, or drowning, whichever would get them first. Now, as the Allies had already seen what the U-boats would do to lone ships, they quickly brought back the escorted convoys. But the Germans then answered with something called the Wolfpack. The U-boats would disperse and go looking for the Allied ships. Once the U-boat spotted a convoy, it'd follow it from a safe distance and radio its position and course to headquarters. From there, other U-boats would be dispatched to prepare the ambush for the whole convoy. They'd wait for nightfall and then attack all at once, which would overwhelm the convoy's protection. It was devastating early in the war, and convoys were losing more than half of their ships. But the Germans went even further when they declared war on America in December 1941. The new U-boats, Type 9, had the range to go all the way across the ocean to the American East Coast, where no one expected any threats. There was no coastal blackout, so the cities were lighting up the ships, while German crews watched from the dark. This was called a second happy time. From January to August 1942, they sank around 600 ships for the loss of about 24 U-boats. By 1942, the Germans were producing more boats than they were losing, and they had more than 100 of them at sea at any given time. As a result, this was the worst year for Allied shipping, with the Allies losing more ships than both Britain and the United States could build. And Britain was yet again on the verge of starvation, like in 1917. The biggest problem for the convoys going to Britain was getting enough air cover. The U-boats had a high chance of being spotted from the air, and the aircraft would then either attack in a strafing run or drop depth charges on it. So aircraft would cover the convoy from America, while on the other side they'd be flying from Britain. But the stretch of ocean in between was where the aircraft couldn't reach from either side, and this is where the German Wolfpacks were waiting. This gap was called the Black Pit. In the spring of 1943, it was finally closed by long-range B-24 Liberator bombers fitted with extra fuel tanks, and by small escort carriers that sailed with the convoys and carried their own aircraft. The U-boats reached their peak strength that same spring. However, in those same months, the Allies found a way to break them. Several ways that worked together, actually. Now a U-boat could no longer surface anywhere in the ocean without risking getting spotted by a plane. But it wasn't just the aircraft. New detection technology also arrived that the U-boats couldn't counter. Planes were carrying new radars that could pick up a surfaced U-boat at night or in fog. And there was also direction-finding equipment, nicknamed Huff Duff, that picked up U-boats' radio signals. And underneath all of it was the code breaking, after the German Navy's Enigma cipher was cracked without them knowing. This gave the Allies information about the U-boat routes and plans, so it pretty much ruined them before they could ambush the convoy. Sonar and radar were improved, as well as the depth charges. The so-called Hedgehog threw a pattern of small bombs ahead of the ship that would go off only if they hit the U-boat. It was much deadlier than standard depth charges, and it didn't set off the unnecessary explosions that would break the sonar contact. So, with all those factors combined, May 1943 got called Black May by the Germans. They lost 41 U-boats, which was a quarter of their operational strength, while they sank only a few Allied ships. Although they had almost completely lost their effectiveness, the Germans still sent U-boats to fight even under horrific losses. The argument was that the Allies should be kept busy hunting U-boats so that those forces wouldn't be used elsewhere against the Germans. So the U-boat crews were literally being sent to die just to buy time. They were even thrown against the Allied Normandy invasion fleet, where they were simply destroyed. And the aces and experienced crews were mostly gone. U-boats were increasingly crewed by young men hurried through shortened training, then sent to sea against an enemy with years of experience and the newest technology for killing a U-boat. By the last chapter of the war, a new crewman's life expectancy had fallen to one patrol, usually their first and their last. The Type 21 that arrived late in the war was actually the first submarine that could stay underwater for an extended time, with several times the battery capacity. But at that point, it was already too late. Out of 40,000 U-boat crewmen, more than 30,000 died, which is roughly a 75% death rate. This was by far the worst rate of any branch of the German armed forces. And as the war was officially ending, there were some mysterious U-boat trips to Argentina, so who knows what and whom they carried there.